actually, hang on a sec, this is going to destroy pension funds, it's going to destroy assets for companies.
Is Granny going to get it in the pension? It's a good question. It's one that we've been grappling with at Commonhold now for the past couple of months. This video is going to be a tough watch for anyone outside the pensions industry, but an important one. When you speak to ministers and other top politicians, they suggest that the government has been told in no uncertain terms that if it were to abolish leasehold tenure or radically reform it, pension funds risk being wiped out and pensioners hit. But is that even the case? We've decided to speak to the experts. Dr. Norma Cohen is a financial journalist who's written extensively about pension funds. So the Freeholder lobby are trying to scare Michael Gove and civil servants, saying that if you do anything radical or meaningful on leasehold, today's pensioners are going to get hit. Now, could you explain if that is the case?
It couldn't be further from the truth. The reality is that under defined benefit pension systems, the employer takes all of the investment risk. Typically, the employer is the predominant decider of how pension assets in a defined benefit scheme are invested, and employers have become increasingly cautious in their approach to investment. But in the event of a shortfall for any reason whatsoever, it is the employer, not the beneficiary, who has to make up the shortfall.
Most of my generation won't have a Scooby about pensions and the schemes. Could you give us a defined benefit pensions for dummies?
Yes, defined benefit pensions were the predominant form of pension savings organized by employers, particularly from the Second World War, and they became increasingly dominant. In a defined benefit pension, you accrue as an employee, you pay a certain percentage of your salary every year, and you accrue the right to draw a pension at retirement that is a percentage of your final salary.
Okay, so when pension investment funds say that Granny's going to get hit, what they really mean is that they might suffer. But here's the next question. Would they really be that badly hit? That depends on how much of their money has gone into residential freeholds and ground rents, as opposed to in other assets. To explain this a bit more, I cajoled my sisters into helping out and to hopefully brighten up this video a bit. We've divided up the floor of this lift lobby in my building into 100 squares. They represent 100% of the 3 trillion, that's 3 million that pension funds have invested. According to this document, the Pensions Purple Book, the bulk of investment is in government bonds. Those investments have been growing steadily for over a decade. They now account for over 72% of the total. When those investments go wrong, the pension funds take a serious hit.
While we were sleeping last night, the UK economy faced a major financial crisis.
A warning from the IMF, central bank intervention.
No wonder investors have no confidence in her government.
The billions of pounds of pension scheme money was invested in funds which were simply not equipped to deal with these kinds of market lurches.
The sell-off sent yields sharply higher as bond prices fell.
They have lost their value very rapidly in the past couple of days, so rapidly that it put into doubt the safety of certain types of pension funds.
The scale of the uncertainty about the markets now mean that the Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng is on the plane that you can see landing back in Britain.
I'm going to be a swashbuckling tax cutter.
I'm going to interrupt because he's out. He's been sacked.
But here he is. Kwasi Kwarteng, should Liz Truss resign?
I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
When bonds go south, all hell breaks loose for pension funds. But what about property? Now we're going to show you how much that makes up of the 3 trillion of overall pension investments. Look at that. The Purple Book says it's between 4 and 5% of total investments, but that's property of all kinds.
I mean, the typical pension fund has, as you say, something around 4 or 5% in property. Some go up 10 or 15%. Some have very little at all. In some cases, have none. But within that, you would typically find the kind of investments you'd have with small and medium-sized pension funds would be not investing directly in property. They would be buying into property funds run either by an investment manager or a specialist property limited partnership, for example. And those companies would be investing in out-of-town shopping centres, offices, industrial premises in some cases, but the sort of things that are paying a reliable and steady level of rental income, so that you can value the income that's going to meet the needs for paying out pensions. It would be very unusual to them to invest in an odd class like freeholds, which are a combination of small little payments year by year, followed by the right to resell that freehold at the end of a term. They're not really a good match for the kind of liabilities that pension funds have.
We don't know the precise breakdown between commercial property and residential freeholds, but the experts we spoke to believe it is just a small fraction of even one of these squares. So how much damage would funds suffer if leasehold were abolished or radically reformed? We asked the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association, who represent all the big pension funds, to give us their take. They said pension funds' aggregate allocation to all types of property, including commercial as well as residential, accounts for 4% of all pension holdings. None of our members have expressed any concerns with us about proposed changes to rules affecting leasehold and ground rents. We wanted to be thorough about this, so we also approached some of the funds known to have invested in residential freeholds and ground rents. Aviva investors are reported to have 1,000 residential estates with 40,000 leaseholders, a drop in the ocean for a fund their size. They told us, quote, Aviva Investors is aware of proposals for leasehold reform, but has no public statement to make at this time. Railpen, the railway workers' pension, said, quote, Gray doesn't comment on speculation or potential changes which may or may not occur in future, and its focus is on progressing the remediation works across the impacted buildings. But in January, their CEO John Chilman called a halt to ground rent purchases, saying, quote, This is one of the few asset classes we've invested in where there is a consumer on the far end, which makes managing the asset much more difficult. It makes it much more emotive. Would we invest in this again? I don't think so. Ground Rents Income Fund PLC, the only publicly traded investor in this asset, have said they will wind up the fund next year. And Long Harbour, the £1.8 billion ground rent fund, are now heavily diversifying into build to rent instead. So for today's grannies and their pension funds, leasehold reform simply is not an issue. But what about the pensions tomorrow, my generation? We don't have the luxury of defined benefit pensions where you've got a guarantee of what's going to be paid out at the end. We've got defined contribution pensions. Let's have another explainer.
From the early 2000s, employers started to realize that the promises they were making on defined benefit pensions were too expensive. And instead, they began offering younger workers the opportunity to save into a defined contribution pension. A defined contribution pension is an investment pot. The employee contributes a certain amount. The employer contributes a certain amount. That sum will roll up, and at the point that the individual is approaching retirement, that individual will be able to access that investment pot. The percentage of DC funds that are invested in property of any sort is very, very small.
This table illustrates what Norma says. These are the investments of today's pensioners, and these are the new defined contribution kind. Look at the difference in property. That tan line is just 4% for defined benefit pensions, but only half that, an almost invisible 2% for my generation's pension pots.
Now, most of that, if not all, is commercial in most cases. And that's particularly true when it comes to the modern type of pension, which is defined contribution, where your pension's based on what you have put in and what investment returns it's made. And those funds, it would be very strange for them to invest in anything that wasn't industrial and commercial property, because the people who are in those pension funds have already got their residential property exposure through the houses and flats that they own themselves. And so it would be doubling their risk if you actually put residential property in such a fund. And I've not seen that done. And I would certainly caution people against doubling up. Residential property isn't just an investment that grows. It's something that has liabilities. It has to be maintained and so on. So it's not a natural thing for a pension fund to invest in.
We're almost done with this brain-frying delve into pensions and leasehold. But there's one last sad and ironic twist to the story for my generation. It turns out the real danger to us comes not from the government abolishing leasehold, but from their failure to abolish it. Leasehold is hurting us and our pension funds.
The irony is that those people who are most likely to be leaseholders in this country are younger people living in urban areas purchasing their first property. The unexpected, unexplained, undocumented demands annually by freeholders and managing agents for additional payments of cash limit the ability of folks your age to be able to make the additional contributions into your pension savings that everyone around you is calling on you to make. And remember that the earlier you start putting money into your defined contribution pension, the more time it has to earn investment returns that will deliver you a bigger pot at retirement.
Remember these first-time buyers whose stories we brought you? They're all enrolled in workplace pensions, but they're paying just the minimum, 3%. Not nearly enough for a decent retirement.
I would love to be able to put more money into that pot and save for my future. But at the end of the day, I've got service charge to pay. I've got ground rent to pay. I've got a mortgage to pay. I've got all, the usual bills. And it's hard enough trying to pay those, let alone think about saving for my future.
I'd love to be able to increase my pension payments because I know how important it is to save for the future, but that is very much a pipe dream after losing £50,000 on the flat that I sold and was in complete desperation to try and sell, and it took 3 years of my life to do so. I'm still rebuilding financially, and I will be for quite a long time after this.
It's extra money that I'm paying out of my pocket at the moment, so I would say around £2,000 a year that I'm probably being overcharged, and that goes over year after year. If you add that up, say over 10 years that you might be living in your first home, that's £20,000. That's £20,000 that you could have otherwise spent on something else or saved, invested into your pension. If you compound that even at an average rate of return in a pension, that £20,000 would become £200,000 within 30 years at the time that you're retiring. Now, that's a significant amount of money then, and it's literally money that I won't have access to anymore because of the control that I lacked during the time that I was living in a leasehold property.
So the pension panic is just another sector myth. Let's hope our politicians are smart enough to see through it. But our investigation has revealed a darker truth. While my generation dance and enjoy themselves, for the flat bars among us, leasehold is silently stealing our futures away.